Hello, Voices of Wrestling listener. Dave Ryan here. Have you ever wondered to yourself how many hidden gems are hidden away inside the last years of World Championship Wrestling? Have you ever asked yourself how many tenuous gags can be made about the name Mike Enos? And have you ever thought about what it sounds like for two Irishmen to interpret a very chaotic company through its B show? The answers to all this and more are just a click away. Check out Days of Thunder every second Thursday on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network.
Do you like wrestling trivia? Then check out the 5-Star Match Game, the Pro Wrestling Quiz Show. I'm Joe Gagney, and every episode, I grill 3 contestants with 5 rounds of power-packed wrestling trivia. We have over 30 evergreen episodes in the archives covering WWE, AEW, Japan, Mexico, and much, 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 much more. Play along at home and check it out today.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, as always, Jesse Collings, and joining me, he's a first-time guest. He is author and historian Ian Douglas. Listeners may be familiar with Ian's work as a biographer. He's having written many books such as The Realest Guy in the Room, The Life and Times of Dan Severn, or Truth Be Told, The Autobiography of B. Brian Blair, among various other works. He has a new book, A Decided Novelty, The Essential Guide to Black Pro Wrestling History, 1880 to 1950, which, as the title would suggest, is a book chronicling the early history of Black pro wrestling. He's a regular voter for the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame, which is our topic of discussion for today. I'd like to welcome Ian Douglas to the show. Ian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Jesse, thank you so much for having me. If this is a gentleman's wrestling podcast, I have no idea what I'm doing here, but I
Oh,
appreciate it
wow.
nonetheless.
That's the first time anyone has ever made that joke.
Well, you're kidding, right?
No, yeah, I'm joking. That happens a
Okay.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, people always ask me about like the name and like I put, I don't know, like maybe like 5 seconds of thought into the name, but it's at least catchy enough for people to remember it, which I think is I just kind of stumbled onto something good.
Well,
But
pro wrestling and gentlemen are often incongruous ideas.
well, that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to start this show, which is the show was kind of the what I wanted to have out of a podcast was I like reading the New Yorker. And I like uh, the idea of having these like kind of long form, really in-depth articles on stuff. And I wanted to have a more intellectual conversation about big topics in wrestling. I definitely never wanted to have a show. It's like we're going to recap last night's episode of television, or we're going to preview a pay-per-view that's coming up, just because there's so much of that. And I wanted to be kind of like this is a highbrow intellectual conversation about pro wrestling, which, as you alluded to, might be lacking in terms of the space. But um,
Once you get Oliver Bateman on here, you're going to be stunned by exactly how highbrow it can get.
well, don't give any spoilers away. But yes,
Okay,
so
I won't.
this is part of the series of podcasts I'm doing talking about the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. I know most of you probably listened to our last episode where I had Adam Berger on and we kind of went over the ballot and kind of who we might be voting for this year. But Ian kind of has a unique perspective and kind of what I would say is a primer for what we're talking about today is that Ian wrote an article last year kind of talking about uh, the history of black pro wrestlers in Wrestling Hall of Fames, and with kind of a deep dive looking at the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame and the comparative lack of black wrestlers that are represented in that Hall of Fame compared to other pro wrestling Hall of Fames. And it's a really good piece. People should definitely go out and read it. It's on Splice today. Um, but it's a really interesting article, and it also touches on a topic that we've talked about a few times on this show, talking about different levels of representation in pro wrestling. And this is in particular looking at the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame and looking at it as in some ways, like a historical monument to the history of pro wrestling. And your piece kind of looks at, well, are we really celebrating the history of pro wrestling if we are not taking into account um, not only the contributions of black wrestlers at the same rate as other institutions, but also kind of acknowledging the different barriers that have been put in place for those black wrestlers and how that is reflected in the way the general voting body seems to interpret the criteria of the Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Yes, 100% correct. I think when it comes to Black pro wrestling history, um, or let's back up just for a second because when you look at the Observer Hall of Fame and you look at the criteria for induction, um, the factors that the factors that contribute to induction nowadays, and it has a lot to do with the specific observer audience, right? They tend to be heavily into work rate, as primarily as defined by Meltzer, but also the consensus surrounding work rate, like activity, move set, realism, selling, bumping, all of those sorts of things. You also have the popularity of the individual. You also have the number of championships they won and the type of championships they won. And all of those things are factors. So when you get into the discussions of does this person belong in as opposed to this other person, then you get into debates about who was the best worker, who was the best seller. You get into who moved the most merchandise, who sold the most tickets, who had the highest buy rates, who won the most championships of a certain type. And nowadays, that especially tends to get distilled down to who held the most world championships and usually world heavyweight championships individually. And when you use that, when you take those metrics and you then apply them retroactively to wrestlers of the past, and I'm not even thinking about black wrestlers in particular now, I'm just speaking about wrestlers of the past in general. Well, then you have to look at the entire era from like 1900 to about 1950, where the majority of the regional promotions, the primary championship was a junior heavyweight championship and not a heavyweight championship. Like for Hawaii, for instance, the for I think the first 15 to 20 years of the Hawaii promotion, the championship belt, or the championship, which has one of the most iconic belt designs of them all, because they actually had a sanctioned Ring magazine championship belt. It was the Hawaii Junior Heavyweight Championship. It was the top belt in the territory. It was the only singles title in the territory. Um, and eventually it got renamed. Well, if you see somebody's name on the ballot nowadays and you say, oh, I've never heard of this person before, they wrestled back in the 1940s. Their heyday was the 1930s and 40s. Let me take a look at some of their accomplishments. And you see they held a handful of belts and a handful of championships, and you see the Hawaii Junior Heavyweight Championship, and you might be inclined to dismiss it. Okay, they didn't hold a world championship. They held this regional title, and it's a junior heavyweight championship. Well, unless you know the history of the territory, you may not realize that was the only belt there for winning, and they won it, and they held it for that maybe for a year or more. So when you remove that context, it becomes hard to evaluate that person. You look at somebody like Ted Germain, and I'm pulling names out of thin air, but you look at somebody like Ted Germain in Boston who wrestled for Charlie Gordon. I don't know that Ted Germain's name has ever popped up on an observer ballot or if it ever will, but the top title promoted by Charlie Gordon in Boston for a long, long time was the World Middleweight Championship, and Ted Germain held it for an eternity. Well, if you were to look up Ted Germain and weigh his credentials for Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame induction, you're going to see he was the world middleweight champion. I mean, that's not even light heavyweight. That's not even cruiserweight. It certainly isn't heavyweight. We're just going to dismiss this. That was the championship belt in Charlie Gordon's territory until Sealy Samara came in late 1937, and he was given the World Heavyweight Championship belt, and due to consolidation of the territories, that title reign was quickly dismissed and forgotten. But somebody with modern eyes would look at Ted Germain's resume and say, oh, he was just a world middleweight championship. That means even less than a cruiserweight championship, and therefore Ted Germain's career was meaningless when he was a massive draw in the New England area for a long, long time. So just taking factors like that into consideration, it becomes very difficult when we're evaluating the careers of wrestlers who peaked prior to really peaked prior to the 1960s, who we have no footage of. Like, we can't evaluate them on the basis of work rate. We can't evaluate them on the basis of style. Unless you do a deep dive, you know very little about their box office appeal. Unless you do a really thorough deep dive, you don't understand the influence that they might have had over the style of wrestling in general or over other performers. And their regional or non world heavyweight championships are meaningless. And so there's a tendency to just disregard entire categories of wrestlers as insignificant for purposes of something like a Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. And that becomes even more grotesquely unfair when we're evaluating black pro wrestlers of the era who were um, influential in a way that we just can't conceptualize nowadays, because um, for someone like the original Rufus Jones, who was also the original Tiger Flowers, Joseph Alvin Godfrey, he's the guy who created the stereotype, really, of the black pro wrestler being the thick-headed, aggressive headbutter, like playing into the stereotype of the era. And he really starts the style in like 1938, the 37, 38. And by the mid 1950s, almost every main event black pro wrestler, or even undercard black pro wrestler, except for maybe Luther Lindsay, is a headbutting machine. Like that begins with one guy, and it's a name that most people have never even heard of. On influence alone, that guy should be in most pro wrestling halls of fame. I mean, it's not just that. He, alongside Bull Curry, he's arguably the top heel, period, in the Midwest and the Northeast for 12, 13 years running. And, well, 12 to 13 years until his life was tragically cut short by a car accident. And most people don't know this, would never know it, and if you just looked up the snapshot of his resume, uh, you would never know it. You'd get no sense of just how important this guy was to pro wrestling. So I know I just said a lot. I'll leave it there and let you comment or ask further questions.
Yeah, well, there's a few things that I wanted to touch on that you referenced. The first is a really good point, I think, when we're talking about using what I would say like contemporary standards to evaluate wrestlers from the past. That isn't always fair. Like you said, if we're going to go back in time and go do some research on a wrestler, especially a wrestler that's like pre 1960, where there's really not going to be a lot of video evidence of him. Not only is there not going to be a lot of video evidence, but there's going to be a lot more, much more limited easy to access documentation. You're really like going through like the newspapers.com archives and hoping that stuff gets triggered. Um, to find that kind of stuff. So you're losing basically the entire context of their careers. You might be able to find cards, and like you said, you might see, oh, they held a junior heavyweight championship, but you don't really understand. It's like, well, that was the main title. That means they were main eventing most shows. Even card layouts in like you can see like, oh, if someone went on last, that means that they're the main event, which historically in many markets is not the case. Especially, I think a perfect example is like Madison Square Garden. Bruno Sammartino did not actually main event a bunch of shows in Madison Square Garden. He worked the show right before the match, right before the intermission, because of the way that those shows were structured, and that's probably true across a lot of different territories. So even just looking at the cards, you don't even totally understand it. So it's very hard, I think, for anyone to kind of do research without going super far into the weeds and understand the full context of these careers, especially as we talk about um, territories that largely predate a lot of what we could say like the modern wrestling industry, or the way at least we understand it. And then the other part of that would be the Observer Hall of Fame in general has a very difficult time inducting anyone from, let's say, the pre-TV era, like late 1960s. There are the obvious people that get in, right? Luthez, Bruno Sammartino, um, Buddy Rogers, whoever, name your super famous wrestler from pre
Frank
before that. Yeah.
Frank Gotch, George
Frank Gotch,
Hackenschmidt.
yeah. Those guys get in. But anyone that's kind of outside that realm has had a very difficult path to get into the Hall of Fame. Um, Probably the person I'm the biggest advocate on the ballot right now is Morse Siegel, and that's largely because Morse Siegel's career as a booker ends in the 1960s largely, and nobody is going back and doing the research on that. And it's actually difficult to do that research. Um, but it's very difficult to get those people into the Hall of Fame. If you look at the
Hmm.
voting results, especially the historical category, I said this on my last pod, but it's worth including. If you look at who is eligible right now, um, in the historical wrestling category, which is where all of these people would be located, that we might be talking about if they were to ever appear on the ballots. But if you look at the kind of that current ballot, it's mostly split into two categories. It's split into people who were um, wrestlers before um, the kind of TV era that we don't have a lot of videotape of. So someone like a Cowboy Bob Ellis is a good example. Um, or it's really famous names that people remember that either didn't have a lot of longevity or only had brief moments where they were a really big star, but people remember them, like the Iron Sheik or the Von Erichs or something like that. And it's really difficult, I think, for some of these older wrestlers that have good cases to get in because of all the things you just touched on, which we
Hmm.
don't have videotape. We don't really know how to evaluate them. Um, and especially if they're outside of the general um, purview of the Hall of Fame, it's becomes a little bit more difficult. Like it took a long time for Johnny Rougeau to get in, who got in last year. And I always said like the reasons for that are we don't have a lot of videotape of Johnny Rougeau. He wrestled for a non-English speaking promotion for the most part in Montreal. And a lot of people just don't know about that territory and haven't consumed that level of history to really understand why, in my opinion, he was a deserving Hall of Famer because he was a big star and drew for all these years. But he's outside of, he didn't wrestle in Memphis in the 80s. He didn't wrestle for, mid-Atlantic. He didn't wrestle in Georgia. He didn't wrestle for the WWF. He didn't wrestle for the AWA. So no, these territories that I think a lot of people know about, and
Hmm.
that becomes very difficult for these people to gain momentum to get to the Hall of Fame.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And and again, when we're applying the same sort of, so you take all of those complications and challenges in getting inducted, and then you apply that to some of the Black pro wrestling pioneers of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And working that backwards, you have gentleman Jack Claiborne, who in one of his latest and most thorough interviews in the mid-ish 1950s, he was complaining that television had ruined wrestling, in particular for wrestlers like him, because he would go on a card in Los Angeles, or he would be on a card in the Northeast, and because they were cobbling together footage for national broadcasts of wrestling, he said that he would be on in one of the first matches, and they wouldn't record it because they were cobbling together footage for a national broadcast that needed to air in the southern states. And the southern stations, the advertisers, they were not comfortable with black wrestlers being on national television, let alone winning matches. And so, categorically, black pro wrestlers who were competent were not allowed on national broadcasts at that time. So that really hurt Claiborne's career. Um, Probably hurt Steely Samara's career as well, and Jim Mitchell's career. And then when you take it even further back, you almost have to look at some of these guys and say, given what they achieved, is it more likely than not that they would have achieved much more if their skin color had been of a different hue, or if their ancestry had been different? And if you actually evaluate career trajectories, you can actually project that. And when you take Jack Claiborne, for example, who from pretty much 1934 onward main evented in every wrestling territory he was in, for the most part, was one of the foremost high flying heavyweights of the era. And also, eh, if you were 6'1", then you were probably 95th percentile in terms of heights and wrestlers. He was also a very chiseled wrestler in the early going. So one of the strongest wrestlers, high flyer, one of the best bodies. He finally goes over to Hawaii in 1948 after he's been doing this for 16, 17 years. And Al Karasik finally gives him a title reign for almost an entire year as the top guy in Hawaii. That's huge. He comes back to California, and the California promoters are doing everything they can to bury and hide the fact that he held the top title in Hawaii. They're showing the photos of him with the ring championship belt and saying, "No, no, no, that's the Negro heavyweight championship belt. That has nothing to do with Hawaii." And then they're saying, given his style, he's like the black Antonino Rocca, even though he debuted something like 10 years before Rocca, was using the same was using the same style, except he was a pioneer of that style, especially as a heavyweight. And fortunately, some of the California writers called that out and said, well, wait a second. He was doing this a decade before Roca was doing it. He's not the black Antonino Roca. Antonino Roca is the white Jack Claiborne. And something like that alone, speaking to his influence and his significance, in most cases, if people had that understanding, would be enough to should be enough to get him past that threshold and get him into most halls of fame. If people understood that, coupled with the fact that when it comes to championship opportunities that had been afforded black wrestlers at the time, that Hawaii championship reign that he had, if we take titles off of it, like let's say Karasik decided to call his championship the world championship because he could have. This is pre NWA. if we make that a world championship, then Claiborne, let's say we make all singles titles world titles just for the sake of the argument, then Claiborne's title reign in Hawaii is almost as long as all title reigns by recognized black pro wrestlers up until that period of time combined. That should get him in my opinion. But again, people don't have that context to make that judgment.
Well, I think in general, the Observer Hall of Fame struggles to put accomplishments within the context of their time, kind of across the board. And I think, like, if you want to compare this to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and the Observer Hall of Fame was intentionally set up in a process to mimic the Baseball Hall of Fame. Like,
After the first year or so when Meltzer just inducted who he wanted and said, here are the no-brainers, they're
yes.
in. Yeah.
Um, Dave also had to do that because we'd still be debating some of these people to get in.
Yeah, probably.
Paul Bowser's probably not making the ballot. If he not finishing high on the ballot if he we had to vote him in today, which if that was the case I'd be going crazy because I'm a Boston guy. um anyway, we're looking at but to put into context, like for baseball, right, we understand that throughout the history of baseball, there have been different eras where statistics, what would be considered an impressive statistic, has changed, right? If
Dead
someone
ball era, steroid
Yeah.
era. Yeah.
If someone, so if we went back and we looked at, let's say, famous Niagara Falls victim, Ed Delahanty, and be like, well, Ed Delahanty, he only hit like 110 home runs. That's like not that impressive of a total. But we also understand in the context, like that was actually a lot of home runs. He was actually one of the best power hitters up until his career ended. So it's like we understand from a history perspective that was impressive. We also baseball also has the Negro League, so which also have there's been a lot of incredible work in terms of updating statistics and chronicling those over the last few years. A lot of dedicated people have done a lot of great work with that, and we can understand. Um, Maybe, if a player never even played in the major leagues, we have statistics to show, okay, this was actually a phenomenal player, and we can understand the limitations of their time prevented them from ever playing in the major leagues, or at least the recognized major leagues
Mm-hmm.
um, at the time. Do we do that with the Wrestling Hall of Fame? I don't think so. I don't think we look back at different wrestlers and say, okay, maybe this person didn't, like you said, win a bunch of what we would consider world titles. Maybe they didn't headline a bunch of 10,000 plus attended shows. All of these things we kind of look at within the context of their time is kind of dismissed. I think you could say a similar case is true for like women's wrestlers throughout history. There's, I believe, only one women's wrestler outside of Japan that's in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame right now, which is Mildred Burke. And June Byers is close to getting in. Do we look at that the same way where it's like, well, they were dealing in a space where women's wrestling was not earnestly promoted in most places. And there was obviously a ceiling put on many women's wrestling performers. So do we look at that and appreciate the accomplishments of some of the women leading up to that? And you could say the exact same thing about black pro wrestlers. And you mentioned, so there are over 280. I think the official total right now, as of this moment, is 284, I want to say, um, inductees into the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. Some of these are as tag teams and things like that. So, um, by my count, there are only seven black pro wrestlers out of that whole group.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if
And
we
who's the earliest? Who's the earliest in terms of their career? My guess
the
would be
early it's
Bobo.
it's got to be Bobo Brazil, right? So just to recap who these people are, and it's very, and especially when we're talking about this in America, right? So I'm gonna go through them really quick. So
Mm-hmm.
Abdullah the Butcher. Does Abdullah the Butcher get into the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame if he does not have his career in Japan? I would say probably not.
I would say maybe.
He was a
But
draw
you're right. You're
in the
right.
United States, but he is a legend in Japan. At one point, he was the highest paid wrestler in the world, in the early '80s when he jumped from um, All Japan to New Japan. Like he is so he is someone that greatly benefited from wrestling outside of America. Bobo Braz,
Puerto Rico too,
yeah,
in
oh
his
yeah,
case, and that's tough because I mean sometimes some things are tough to isolate
right,
because it's for some of these guys it's difficult if they're not big in Japan, they may not also have gotten the opportunities they received in Puerto Rico because
true.
Colon did care about those things.
Hmm.
He loved to bring in Hanson and Brody and those guys
Yeah.
as well.
So Bobo Brazil, he's in without his career in Japan, although he was a big star in Japan at times. But I think it's safe to say that he was a big enough star in the United States where I think he would check
Hmm.
the boxes enough. Ernie Ladd, I think a similar scenario is mostly in for his American career. Same with
And
Bearcat.
and Ernie for his connection to football as
Yeah,
well. That
and
helps propel him.
Bearcat Wright, I think would be in. Um, Carlos Colon, of course, I definitely think would not be in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame if it wasn't for his career in Puerto Rico. I think that's a safe to assume bet.
Yes.
Um, The Rock obviously is in based on his career in the United States, and then the last is Aja Kong, who obviously would not be is obviously because of her career in Japan.
Hmm.
So even within the context of the limited black wrestlers we do have in the Hall of Fame, several of them would also struggle to get in if they were not working outside the United States, largely because of the limiting career factors that black wrestlers have historically had kind of across the history of the United States.
Yeah, and
Um,
I mentioned I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up at this point as well or later, but
mhm,
I'll throw it on the table now. Like you also have the differing opinions on who gets to be black
mhm.
to some extent. Like Dwayne obviously is half black, half Samoan. The Rock is half black, half Samoan, and you have a lot of people who, when they say he's the first black WWE champion, you have plenty of people who've jumped in and said no because he's half Samoan, he doesn't count. That I mean that's a discussion that gets had.
Yes, I'll
I,
be staying out of that discussion.
well, yeah, I'll be staying out of that discussion too. Like half white me, nobody wants to hear me weigh in on this. Uh, Aja Kong, who's half black, half Japanese. By the way, when I did my initial calculation, I missed her because I was just okay.
Yeah,
All the Japanese names I
that's a
for
real nerd thing to say. Like, actually, Aja Khan. Yeah, but yeah.
yeah, and it was a real nerd who I respect who brought that up to me. But yeah, and then Carlos Colon, you look at miscegenation in Caribbean countries. How black is he versus how whatever else within the
Mhm.
milieu of Puerto Rican heritage, etc. But but he looks dark enough so like he gets the check mark. But in terms of un unqualified, and by unqualified I mean we don't doubt their blackness. We don't have to debate it in any way. Um, you're really talking about 4 out of 7 in the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. Okay, please continue.
So, and that's it's interesting. It's also, and that's why I say it's important to get the context of this because it's put it. We need to, if we're gonna interpret wrestling history, we need to be able to, as people who are voting on this and trying to uh, support this kind of monument to wrestling history. It's, I think, our responsibility to understand the context of these individual accomplishments beyond the kind of who worked main events, who worked big shows and big territories, and really do our due diligence in terms of the voting body. And I think that is in particular the case when we're talking about black wrestlers, and I think it's limiting. And one of the reasons we have so many few inductees is because we're not taking everything into consideration. Um, this year, there are a number of black wrestlers on the ballot,
Hmm.
which would still, in a lot of ways, be underrepresented, uh, but at least for the sake of this year. So by my count, we have Mercedes Monet, first time candidate on the ballot. We'll see how she does. I would be very surprised if she got in, but um, at least is a first time candidate. We have Junkyard Dog, who I think stands a good chance of getting in since he came very close to getting in last year and seems to be gaining momentum. Sweet Daddy Siki, first time candidate on the ballot after his death earlier this year. And then Doral Dixon, who is in the Mexico section, who has actually a decent chance of getting in as well. He was the leading vote getter in Mexico last year and that did not get in. So a chance for him to get in. So we could be uh, increasing the ranks significantly relatively if JYD and Doral Dixon get in this year. Um, but I think, are we putting their careers in the proper context to give those people a fair shake? And I'm not even talking about people that have never been on the ballot before. I'm just talking about the people that are on the ballot right now. Do we, I think out of those names, I think JYD is the only one that I think gets any form of, I think, consistent acknowledgement that his accomplishments as a black man um, are understood in terms of being a major drawing black babyface in the Deep South during a time period where there really wasn't a lot of people that could say that had that kind of other black wrestlers that could be in that position, I guess.
Hmm.
He's the only one that I think really gets that kind of credit from the voting body, just based on what I've heard.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned Sweet Daddy Siki. See, that's one I actually approach differently because um, for some people, if they read a decided novelty or they read Gentleman Jack and Rough Rufus, the two most recent books I've written, um, that might hurt Sweet Daddy Siki's Hall of Fame candidacy and credentials in their eyes because I, I'm I'm on the record where I say, okay, he took the name Reginald Siki from Reginald Siki Berry, who
Mhm.
was the black pro wrestling prodigy, who the Zabiscos really gave him his start after he was wrestling as Leonard the Snake Robinette in Kansas City. They take him on tour. They make him an attraction, even though he's losing the overwhelming majority of his matches. Um, Early 1930s, he more or less bails on the U.S. scene and goes off to Europe, where he is also a big star. He's living in Nazi occupied Europe and ends up in a Nazi prison, not a Nazi concentration camp, but in a Nazi prison for over a year. And when he finally makes it out of that prison during a prisoner exchange, he's not the same guy. But he's 50 years old, and now he's attempting to navigate a U.S. territorial system that is very different from the one he left behind when he was part of the Zabisco's traveling circus. And then he dies of a heart attack in December 1948, and they sort of and so he's when people are mentioning the name Reginald Siki, and Sweet Daddy Siki started his career wrestling as Reginald Siki, that I don't know that it's right to say that it rubs me the wrong way, but the fact that he's sort of uh, it wasn't really an homage to the original Reginald Siki. He's kind of uh, leeching off of whatever lingering acknowledgement, recognition there was to that name to use it to benefit his own career. And then combining that, if it wasn't obvious, I'm a huge Jack Claiborne fan, retroactively. Uh,
Yeah,
Combining that,
not in its time.
certainly not. But if you look at the only footage we have of Jack Claiborne, who was throwing a dozen drop kicks a night in what was a glorified boxing ring and taking those bumps on that stiff mat and enduring the harsh travel conditions of the era. And you see him in Australia in 1951, I think. So you've got like 1 minute of match footage, and he's broken down. He's overweight compared to his peak form, and yet he's standing flat-footed, throwing drop kicks, connecting with the chin of a 6'3" opponent, and he's doing the monkey flip, pop to his feet, toe touch that you would see Carlos Colon doing in every match he ever did in Puerto Rico in the 1980s, except based on the clippings and match reports, these are things that Claiborne was doing in the 1930s, and by that time, he's mixing in with the drop kicks and the high flying stuff. He's also doing the jumping headbutts. And then you look at a Sweet Daddy Siki match from 1960, and it's the exact same act, except that Siki is far younger and far shorter than Jack Claiborne was. So, um, someone like me looks at Sweet Daddy Siki's uh, origin and his repertoire and says, well, the entire thing was borrowed, at least in the early stages of his career, from the pioneers that preceded him who never got any credit. So it's tough for me. I will tell you, I did not vote for Sweet Daddy Siki on my ballot because it's tough for me to look at him knowing what I know about the wrestlers that preceded him and um, seeing the credit that they did not receive. It's tough for me to want to give him credit when my perception now is that he borrowed way too much from guys who still have not received any recognition. Now, if they were to receive recognition, maybe my opinion would change. But as for now, I did not vote for Sweet Daddy Siki.
Wouldn't that the counterpoint to what you just said be that if Sweet Daddy Siki got in and was recognized as a Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Famer, that would enhance the legacy of these guys like Jack Claiborne in the sense of Siki's own by enhancing Siki's legacy as a or the second Siki um, legacy as a Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Famer, it would enhance the case of like, well, if that guy's a Hall of Famer, then he was clearly inspired by, to use a generous term, these other wrestlers who came before him.
My rejoinder to that is that only makes logical sense if people know who Jack Claiborne and the original Reginald Siki
Mhm.
are to begin with. Uh, my presumption is that most people will say, oh, Sweet Daddy Siki died recently. I hear that he was this pioneering figure. I'm going to
Mhm.
vote for him. And they're going to leave it at that. And the information I'm going to sound like I'm plugging my book. I'm not, unless not really, but
No, but I want to recognize this is important that you have done an enormous amount of work to document this stuff. So it's not
unless
a plug as much as this is the necessary work that we need that people should consume if they're interested and want to learn more.
yeah, thank you. Unless you read a decided novelty, unless you read Rough Gentleman Jack and Rough Rufus, you're not going to have the familiarity with Claiborne or Claiborne, Rufus, the original Reginald Siki, to make that connection between what those guys did in the 1930s and what Siki was doing in the late 50s and early 60s. And it's uh, Bearcat Wright, I believe, was born in 32 and Sweet Daddy Siki was born in 33. So just for the sake of putting this in the proper frame of reference, Bearcat Wright was born the year that Jack Claiborne debuted, the year after I think Jim Mitchell debuted. And Sweet Daddy Siki Sweet Daddy Siki, born the year after. All of those guys were already active. Tiger Nelson, Gorilla Parker. I mentioned Jim Mitchell. Sealy Samara was a couple years away from making his debut. Um, the original Rufus Jones, aka the original Tiger Flowers, had already made his debut in the Boston area. So, and these guys, those with longevity from that era, were 20 years into their career, give or take, before Bearcat Wright even debuted. Um, and it was even longer before Sweet Daddy Siki made his debut. And unless you read unless you read A Decided Novelty or Gentleman Jack and Rough Rufus or do a lot of independent research on your own, you're not going to be able to make that connection. And it's not that I'm calling observer voters lazy, because there are only so many hours in the day and there's only so much time you can devote to doing pro wrestling research that someone hasn't already taken an interest in and neatly laid out for you. So I just don't trust that most people would be able to make those connections, and I don't blame them for not being able to do it, because wrestling history is not very tidy, and it takes an awful lot of work to aggregate all the information together and present it in a neat and tidy format.
Yeah, especially if we're going the further you go back in history. Like if you Google some of these names that we're discussing, you're not going to get 10,000 hits with a bunch of easy to digest information. It's a lot of like newspaper archival research. And if you're doing that, how reliable is that information? Is that just fluff coming from a promoter that they're running in the back of a sports page from
Hmm.
1936? It's a lot of individual work. Um, with Sweet Daddy Siki, what do you think about? Because this is something that's kind of intrigued me of him as a candidate. You mentioned, so you have like this kind of what I feel like is like an archetype for black wrestlers of the 50s and 60s, which I'll just say is like the Bobo Brazil archetype, which is like, you know, big, strong, black baby face kind of character.
He
Sweet
throws a
Daddy.
lot of headbutts. Yeah.
Yeah, that throws a lot of headbutts, but I'm thinking, like Bobo Brazil, like your Sailor Art Thomas, or these kind of characters, kind of like basically JYD would be a next generation kind of version of that kind of wrestler.
Hmm.
Um, and then so what do you think? Sweet Daddy Siki though is not really that kind of wrestler, especially once he goes to Canada and he kind of does this basically this Black Buddy Rogers gimmick,
Hmm.
where he's a heel, which I don't know, at the time seems pretty novel for a major black star to be a heel wrestler in that kind of role. Um, what do you feel? Do you feel like that's overblown?
Um,
Because that's what's
over.
intrigued me about him. Because when we look at who is in the Hall of Fame, right, for black wrestlers, I feel like a lot of black wrestlers are pigeonholed into a certain character that they had to be. And when Siki was in the United States, he was Sailor R. Thomas's tag team partner.
Hmm.
Um, but when he goes to Canada, and especially when he's in Calgary, it does feel like he is, I don't want to say innovating, but he is playing a really different role than a lot of his black contemporaries were allowed to be.
Yeah. Well, again, uh, when you look at who was allowed, and this is not me wanting to take credit away from him, because yes, he was innovative in that role. Um, the Black Pro Wrestling heel in Canada, like the original Rufus Jones, Joe Alvin Godfrey had that completely locked down, had that gimmick completely locked down. And he could be he could be somewhat flamboyant in his lifestyle, in terms of what he did outside of the ring and during his interviews. But then he would also get in the ring and be the most dastardly of dastardly heels. And he did not, that I recall. Maybe he did. He was huge, as Rufus Jones. He was huge in the Pacific Northwest, and down into Utah, which is where he unfortunately died in a car accident in 1951, in Ogden. But again, that sort of a thing, and again, it isn't that Sweet Daddy Siki didn't make some tweaks and innovations, but the fact that a black heel wrestler who was kind of, I don't want to say he was undersized. Rufus Jones was only 5'7.5", about the same size as Sweet Daddy Siki was. But he proved the case decades earlier that a black heel in Canada could be a major box office attraction for a long, long time.
Yeah. The other thing, and kind of going back to our previous conversation and tying it into Sweet Daddy Siki, and to a lesser extent, Dory Dixon, because Dory Dixon's background, I think, is different. He's, from Jamaica, and he kind of broke into wrestling in Mexico. Um, with these guys, we're also seeing them like if you listen to Sweet Daddy Siki, and Greg Oliver has done a ton of did a
Mm-hmm.
ton of interviews and stories about him later in his life. Um, his career is definitely limited working in the United States during a time period. And you mentioned what Jack Claiborne said, which is really fascinating in the sense of like once wrestling became on TV, um, there became this real concern about how black wrestlers are going to be pushed. And that's when you see a lot more of like I guess like segregation in wrestling cards. And if you're going to
Yeah.
have black wrestlers, there's going to be, it's going to be one black wrestler wrestling another black wrestler. And that's kind of like the token match that you might see on some cards, if you see them at all. Sweet Daddy Siki moves to Canada in large part because uh, for he was easier for him to get booked. I know he married a white woman, and he always stated that that hurt his bookings. He was a pretty big star in Texas when he was in the early parts of his career, just going through um, looking at the cards and things like that, seeing him, wrestling in main event programs and doing a lot of like kind of uh, blooded brawl kind of stuff that was big in Texas at the time period. But he becomes this Canadian wrestler in Toronto and later Stampede. And while he's successful there, it's hard to imagine that he would have been as limited if he was white. Um, and I think that's really important context for both him and Dory Dixon. Dory Dixon's this great wrestler who is obviously could have been a big star in the United States potentially. He worked, Madison Square Garden. He did some stuff for Vince Sr. and wrestled. I think he wrestled like Buddy Rogers and stuff right when that promotion was first starting in the early 60s. But his career is also definitely limited in the United States. And so how do we take that into consideration when we're looking at their overall Hall of Fame candidacy? That's the kind of missing thing that I think a lot of the um, uh, voting body is failing to consider.
Yeah. Absolutely. And not, it's going to, again, I'm going to take this back to Claiborne, and I'm only going to do it because I've just, the bulk of my research is on Claiborne and Jones. But in Texas, the boxing commission oversaw wrestling, and they passed the law that there could be no matches between black and white boxers, and they could also not have matches between black and white wrestlers. So when Claiborne comes down from Oregon to wrestle in Texas, it was like 1934 or 35. He's brought in, and they attempt to bring him in as a Cuban, as if nobody would notice, and this happens frequently. And he's permitted to wrestle in he's permitted to wrestle across the border in Mexico, where he's presented as an Ethiopian, which the Italians had invaded Ethiopia at the time. So he's wrestling against his Italian opponent, who wasn't actually Italian, and
Of course,
he
yeah.
he wins his match, and the Mexican fans storm the ring, and they place him up on their uh, shoulders, and they carry him around the ring, screaming "Viva Ethiopia!" And then across the border in El Paso, the promoter tries to get him on the card, and nope, sorry, he's banned because he's black, and we don't care how Cuban you say he is. This applies to skin color, not nationality. So he's done. And later in the decade, you end up with some black only wrestling cards. And the biggest star from that era to come off of the to come out of those promotions was Cyclone Johnny Cobb, who later winds up wrestling in the Midwest, primarily in Wisconsin. Um, and there was an article written during World War II where he'd been drafted and he's the cook in a kitchen, but he's talking about how he got his start as a pro wrestler down in Texas. But yes, regionally, these guys were very limited in terms of where they could go. It wasn't until the late 1940s where Don Blackman and Don Kindred were permitted to cross into Virginia from crossed into Virginia from Pennsylvania,
Yeah,
where
the
they'd been,
Mason-Dixon line.
yeah, where they'd been wrestling as teammates on some cards. They were permitted to cross into Virginia, and that was like the test case to see if two competent black wrestlers in the South could draw, and they opened up the balconies. And even though it wasn't the main event of the show, it really was the main event of the show, and it was a huge hit with black pro wrestling fans. And so then the original Jim Crockett comes back a few years later, and he books Don Blackman and Buddy Jackson on shows in not only Virginia, but also North Carolina and South Carolina. And that became the model for a decade for booking black wrestlers in the southern states. Is you'd pair them up and just bring them in to wrestle each other in the Negro match. They also did that with Willie Love and Bud Richardson later on into the 60s. Don Blackman doesn't get nearly enough credit for being a guy who really launched black black pro wrestlers' careers. He went on his all Negro tour of the South, where he really brought the first all black wrestling shows into the Deep South, where he went down there with Buddy Jackson, he went down there with Alex Kaffner, he went down there with Frank James, who later ends up on a tag team in the Northwest with Don Kindred called the Brown Bombers, and they're the first black tag team to win a major race neutral tag team championship really anywhere in North America. And uh, taking it back to what you were saying about Canada, Toronto especially became one of the regions that was especially friendly to black wrestlers early on. Jack Claiborne, when he was already on the downside of his career and getting banned from different NWA friendly territories because he ran afoul of Al Karasik, he ends up in Toronto teaming with uh, young Luther Lindsay, and they become the Canadian Tag Team Champions. That's the first black babyface tag team to win a race neutral championship in North America. And then Claiborne, who I'm sure didn't take too kindly to this, he quickly gets swapped out of that tag team combination for a young Bearcat Wright when the promoters likely realized that he couldn't go like he used to. But yeah, I would say that Sweet Daddy Siki made a wise career move heading to Canada, because Canada was a place that, in comparison to some of the other territories, was more black friendly at the time. At least that was its reputation.
Yeah, and I think it's worth like reviewing up like a bunch and understanding a bunch of the institutional limitations that we have that are impacting these guys' careers. There's limited territories that they can work in, and even fewer limited territories that are going to give them anything, uh, you know, that would be considered like a push or a start, so there's that. You also bring up a good point about how like you would have the designated Negro match. You'd have one wrestler and they would wrestle another Negro wrestler, which is extremely limiting from like like a talent progress development perspective. If you're just wrestling the same person or the same handful of wrestlers every single night, it's very difficult to become a good pro wrestler with that limited amount of opponents. It's something that if you talk to any wrestling trainer today, will say I think it's come up a lot with women's wrestling over the last several years, where it's like if you're only gonna let um like women's wrestling like if you're not going to do intergender wrestling, it's very difficult for women's wrestling on the independent scene to get any better because there's only so many women's wrestlers. They're only the best way for them to get better is for them to wrestle the male wrestlers. And you can take that and go back in the time machine and say like, well, if black wrestlers only permitted to wrestle a handful of other black wrestlers, they have an uphill battle in progressing as an overall wrestler, if they are not getting as diverse of an experience as their contemporaries. Um, so that's interesting to note. And then, especially as we move further in time, as the territory system changes and gets consolidated in a lot of ways, we then move into this era where a very, very small number of people are end up basically controlling the wrestling industry and deciding who gets to be a star and who is going to get pushed. And I think that more than anything is responsible for the limited number of black wrestlers we see in the Observer Hall of Fame because there are decades and decades really go by where the amount of true main event pushed black wrestlers in the United States is can be counted on one hand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when you look at who are the strongest candidates, there's a reason I think that we're going back to the pre-television era. Um, in that
Yeah,
is this huge, huge issue, and we can't correct it. We can't go back in time and make it so it's different. So the best we can do is kind of evaluate the and understand the institutional limitations to a lot of talent.
yeah. When you if you read my essay, if you count the number of black pro wrestling title reigns during the 80s in what we would consider to be a major territory in that
Mhm.
era, go ahead and name them.
Uh, right on the in the US.
In the US, yeah, name them.
I did read this yesterday, so now I want to be able to make sure I get it correct. Is the answer none?
The answer would be it depends on what you consider a
Yeah.
major
So like
championship.
JYD was a champion, but would his title be considered a major championship?
See, I would say no. But when
Yeah.
you look at let's take Jim Crockett Promotions and let's take the World Wrestling Federation.
All right. So those two titles, basically the NWA World Championship and
Yeah,
the
but
WWF.
I'm even saying tag team
Oh,
championships.
oh,
I'm
yes.
saying the
Okay, okay,
undercard
yes. Now I remember.
championships in those
The
territories.
answer is one. It's Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson, correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's them. From the time that they went truly national, it's
Mhm.
them, and that it flies in the face of logic when you compare that to something like the boxing title picture in just about every weight division during the same era. You had black fighters up and down those cards, and in a lot of weight divisions, the title picture is dominated by black fighters. But when you apply that same lens to pro wrestling, I mentioned in the essay, like there's a reason that a lot of black wrestling fans fondly remember when Virgil won the $1 million championship from Ted DiBiase, even though it's this non-sanctioned championship, and that's because from the time the WWF became a truly national promotion, if you if you discard the Rocky Johnson Tony Atlas title reign as being like that was right at the jumping off point, and by the time most people nationally were tuning in, that wasn't even being mentioned anymore. You have to go several years, and it's Virgil who's the first to hold an unsanctioned championship. And then the first time you get black pro wrestling champions in the WWF of any kind, when it's truly a national and international promotion, it's men on a mission winning the tag team championships. And I don't even think they appeared on television with the titles because that was a house show victory. So that image of black wrestler as champion in the WWF is something that I think eluded fans until Ahmed Johnson won the Intercontinental Championship.
Yeah, and so it's one of those things, and I think um, the conversation takes me back to, do you remember the Oscars controversy of, I want to say it was 2013 or 2014, regarding the Oscar nominees? It was hashtag Oscars so white, talking about the complete lack of representation in the Oscar nominations. You remember what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So I remember the conversation at the time being, I was in college at the time, which would be, the argument would be, well, what movies would be nominated? Like name an actor, name a movie that should be nominated that came out this year. And that's not really the conversation that we're having. The conversation should be, why does this institution refuse to, in the case of movies, like financially support black-led movies or movies that have black leading roles in it, or are directed by a black wrestler director, or any director of color. Um, and I feel like conversation somewhat, especially when we talk about modern wrestling, like the answer is not, well, like, if who should be on this Hall of Fame ballot, like name a black world champion. You can't, so therefore that this is fine. But the real question is, there are many, what has happened in this institution that has prevented black wrestlers from being able to succeed to the degree where they would be considered obvious Observer Hall of Fame candidates based on the criteria that has been set up. Um, and I think that's an important discussion, and relevant when we're having uh, this conversation. I think last year I was talking to Lyric Swinton about this, and she mentioned a really good point where she mentioned Shelton Benjamin, right? Let's look at Shelton Benjamin's career.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Shelton Benjamin came into WWE. He had a lot of things going for him. Incredible athlete, good worker, had a ton of potential, got a mid-card push, won the Intercontinental Championship, but he reached a very critical point of his career where the company said, okay, this guy is going to take the net. We need to figure out if this guy is going to take the next step in order for him to become a true main event star where we can maybe headline WrestleMania with him one day. What did the company do at that time? What did they give Shelton Benjamin to help him maybe come over? Maybe he wasn't a great promo. Maybe he needed a little help with his character. What did the company give him? They gave him a mammy character that was super embarrassing, and his career never recovered from that.
Mm-hmm.
He's probably doing his best work now that since the mammy character was introduced, and I'm pretty sure it was introduced in 2005, so it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And you compare that to, say, uh, what did the company do for Brock Lesnar, right? Brock Lesnar, University of Minnesota product, obvious guy they wanted to push as a big star. What did they do for him to help him overcome maybe his promo or character weaknesses? They gave him Paul Heyman.
Mm-hmm.
Dave Batista, another contemporary. What did they do to help him? They put him in this storyline with Evolution and Triple H and Ric Flair, and they gave him this huge, huge angle to eventually get him over, because the company was really committed to getting those guys over as stars. And then you have Shelton Benjamin, who maybe had the same potential as those guys, or even greater potential than those guys. And what was he given? He was given a really stereotypical, insulting character that submarined his entire career. So I don't think Shelton Benjamin's ever going to appear on this ballot because of what happened to him. And I don't think it had anything to do with uh, his talent or his work ethic or anything that he could really control. It was almost entirely because of the way a very small number of people, or in this case, perhaps only one person in Vince
Hmm.
McMahon, viewed him and what his career could be. And I think that's something that is context that's really important to understand when we talk about these wrestlers. And so when we think of somebody like a Mercedes Moné as a candidate, and people can weigh in on whether they feel like she is a deserving candidate on this ballot or not, um, but you think of the environment that she stepped into as a young black woman in WWE in the mid 2010s, and what
Very different. Hmm.
she had, but what she has been able to accomplish, and put that into the context of where the things that have institutionally been working against people that look like her.
Hmm.
Um, and for her, it's almost a double whammy of being a woman and being black. Um, and so, do we properly appreciate that? I think it's something that's worth evaluating if you're looking at the ballot this year.
Yeah, I agree. And you made an excellent point about writing for one person, who in this case being Vince McMahon, and that may have to do with some, you know, an anachronistic, prejudicial thinking, conceptualizing of talent on the part of somebody who inherited or bought the company from his father, who'd been wrestling for an eternity, who'd been promoting for an eternity, but in the from the time period that Vince, where from the time period that Vince began observing what was going on in wrestling, I'm sure the structure was something like, okay, we have the guy on top who can appeal to the majority of paying
Mhm.
fans in our area, but we also need to make sure we have a black guy on the card to appeal to the minorities. And that's the thinking. And in in some respects, Vince probably thought, okay, what is his understanding of blackness? His understand According to Carlito, Vince's understanding of a Puerto Rican was a pimp at one point. That is a very dated 1970s conceptualization of what a Puerto Rican stereotype in New York City at the time. But that was Vince's go-to, and Carlito said he didn't like that and he didn't want to do it. Uh, when you look at Sheldon Benjamin, yeah, he gets saddled with a Mammy character. Off the top of my head, I don't recall what was done with Booker T during the time that they started pushing him as a baby's face, aside from the fact that Triple H makes the obvious racist allusions of, like, your type of wrestler, you know what your job is to do, entertain me, dance for me, Booker, and then beats him anyway at WrestleMania. And apparently nobody realized that there would be some lingering hurt feelings with black fans over that, or thought that they wouldn't care, or that it didn't matter anyway. But yes, there are certain obstacles that have historically been put in the paths of black wrestlers who were ascending the ladder, even in relatively recent history. And it's very unfortunate, and it does affect the way we contextualize and evaluate their candidacy for the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame nowadays. And unfortunately, I don't know how you correct for that, unless uh, unless they have unless Dave assigns some sort of super committee that can evaluate, especially the pre-TV era stuff, and says, okay, who are the guys that absolutely need to be in here that are just simply never going to get in otherwise? Um,
And he will induct people that don't ever appear on the ballot because he feels that they're historically significant and they would never get the votes to put him in.
who did he do that for? I mean,
He's
I
done it.
honestly don't know.
He has done it several times. He did it. The last person I can remember off the bat. So he did it for Lou Darrow, who was a promoter in the LA area. during the first half of the 20th century. This is goes back to my Morris Siegel issue where I think you should do that with Morris Siegel, but he said because Morris Siegel's already on the ballot, he just has to get the votes, which is going to be like super, super difficult because Morris Siegel was a promoter that started promoting in 1911. Um, he's done that with a few international, like non like outs like rest of the world candidates. I know he did it with like Colonel George McLaughlin, who you might actually be familiar with, but was
Like, yes, I am.
yeah.
Only
Most
because
people aren't, but I
only
know
bec
yeah,
only
I know
because
from
of
your
what I'm researching right now.
yes.
McLaughlin was big in the Detroit area, and he wrestled Duncan Ross. This is right after Duncan Ross has sort of taken over Cleveland through Buffalo as like the kingpin, leveraging the fact that he was one of the best all around athletes in the world
Mhm.
and booking himself as the mixed wrestling champion of the world. And so he had, Ross was kind of ahead of his time. He books himself to beat McLaughlin in Cleveland, which is Ross's base of operations.
Wait, was
Uh,
he the first booker to ever book himself as champion?
he was
What a historic that's very historically relevant.
Yeah, he books himself as champion in Cleveland. He brings in, I'm forgetting the guy's name. He's one of the first Japanese stars to make entry into the US.
Mhm.
He beats the Japanese wrestler who he's also training, but people don't know that. Um, he beats him, but he books it so that that guy breaks his ribs. And then he goes up to Detroit and loses to McLaughlin, who targets Ross's ribs. And then Ross claims, well, it was an unfair targeting of my ribs, so I'm still the mixed World Wrestling Champion back in Cleveland, while McLaughlin gets to say he's the world champion in the Detroit region. So,
And this is
yes,
like in the 1870s, basically.
this is in 1884.
Okay, yes. So, like, he's done that with those kind of wrestlers, but it's kind of to your point where it's like these are guys that should be in, but he just decides these guys are never going to get the votes from the voting body for reasons that we've discussed previously. So
Mhm.
he puts them in. So I think he did that with Henri Deglane. I know he did that with Paul Pons. Um, he's done it with. I think he did. I don't know. I can't remember if Gus Sonnenberg got voted or not. I'm pretty sure he probably. I'm pretty sure Gus Sonnenberg probably wasn't voted. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
Dave put him in. So
Paul
basically,
Pons, who got embarrassed by Dan McLeod in Canada. When McLeod, the Scotsman, goes in, I'm cluing people in into what my next book is about. McLeod goes in and wrestles under the name George Little, and Pons doesn't know who he is, and says that he can throw the bet is he can throw McLeod he can throw George Little 3 times in an hour, and he fails to do it once. And I think McLeod even beats him. And Pons leaves in disgrace. And then McLeod ends up getting arrested and sued for uh, for wrestling under a pseudonym, but it ends up getting dropped. Anyway, yes.
so Dave has historically done this for people that he feel like they should be in, but they are never going to get the votes. So, I mean, I think it would be if we're talking about like someone like Jack Claiborne, right? I almost think it would be great if he just got inducted into the Hall of Fame. We can all pat ourselves on the back, but I think it'd almost be better for him to appear on the ballot and then for
Hmm.
their because that would ultimately encourage more people, I think, to research this guy's background. Now, you run into the gambit of a lot of people are just not going to do the research and they're going to be like, this guy, I've never even heard of him. I'm going to vote for the Iron Sheik instead,
Yeah.
which happens a lot.
Hmm.
Um, but I think would probably, if the goal is overall to let more people know about this guy's career, then that's something that I think is worth probably doing. But it's all up to whoever Dave decides to put on the ballot.
See, and I don't know that this would really be in service. I almost um almost conceiving of it as if it were the Negro Leagues, as if it was a separate thing, where
Hmm.
you almost have a separate category and you put the original Rufus Jones, Buddy Jackson, Don Kindred, Don Blackman, Jack Claiborne, Jim Mitchell, you put them all in their own category. and the people who are familiar with it can pick three. And if we do it based on the percentage of the ballots that way, it provides an opportunity for them to get inducted. Yeah, and people are gonna say this is DEI, and that's fine. I don't care. Um, it at least encourages people to look up these guys' careers and try to put it in the proper context.
Yeah, which is hopefully like the whole point of the Observer Hall of Fame is it's not a physical building. You can't go and visit it. It's not a tourist attraction. The entire existence is to celebrate and serve as like a monument to the individuals that have made the pro wrestling industry what it is. And in a lot of cases, it does a really good job at that, but that doesn't mean that it can't be improved.
Well,
Um,
speaking of that, speaking of the physical halls of fame, and this is a minor plug for the most recent book, but it also speaks to the importance of
mhm.
doing this research. Um, Clarence Bolden, who I researched, who was half black, and nobody knew about that background when he wrestled in Buffalo, and he won two world championships in the lower weight divisions during that era, and Frank Gotch was referring to him as the best pound for pound pro wrestler in the world at the time. And he got his opportunities in all likelihood because nobody realized that he was half black. They billed him as the Cuban Wonder, and he divorced his black wife. He married a white woman and lived the remainder of his life into the 1960s as a white man. And when I did the research for this book and was able to confirm using census records and marriage records and everything else, yes, undeniably he was half black. Uh, I, the Ringer, the Ringer published that article, and a extended version of that is in a decided novelty, the book. Once the book was published, members of the Bolden family came out of the woodwork messaging me and thanking me for the fact that I shed this light on their grandfather and great grandfather. And I presented this information to Seth Turner at the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame and said, like, look, and I also sent it to Gerald Briscoe, who oversees things for the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, and I sent it to Brian Blair, who has a lot of
Mhm.
influence over the CAC's Hall of Fame. And a lot of times they like to see that if, in the case of a deceased individual, they like to see that there is a family member that they can bring forward to accept the recognition on their behalf. Um, Seth Turner at the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame got back to us almost immediately and said, your timing was perfect. Clarence Bolden's getting inducted. He's receiving the Trailblazer Award. We're going to bring his family up to New York for the induction. The plaque's going up in the Hall of Fame, and they're getting the Hall of Fame ring. Uh, that was awesome. Outside of book sales, that is, I mean, things like that are way more important to me, that these guys are finally starting to get some acknowledgement. And I immediately followed that up by saying, hey, we could do this every year. Here are 12 guys who I think are deserving of some sort of recognition. Here's a mini bio on each and why I think they deserve it. And here you go. You can do what you want with it, but hopefully we see some of these names in the Hall of Fame eventually. Um, and hopefully the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame can do something to get recognition for these Black pro wrestling pioneers.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Ian, for joining the show. Do you have anything else you want to plug? I know we've talked about some of your recent work so far, but if there's anything formally you want to give a shout out towards.
Well, you can find all of my books on Amazon. It's Ian Douglas, IANDOUGLASS. If you type in Ian Douglas with just one else, you're going to get a prominent science fiction writer. If you want to follow me on Instagram, even though I post next to nothing on there, it's Ian Mac Douglas, IANMACDOUGLASS. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I am at Stream, STREAM Glass, Glass.
All right. Thanks a lot. Again, I appreciate you being on the show, and thanks for all my listeners, and we'll talk to you again after a while. Bye-bye.
Hello, Voices of Wrestling listener. Dave Ryan here. Have you ever wondered to yourself how many hidden gems are hidden away inside the last years of World Championship Wrestling? Have you ever asked yourself how many tenuous gags can be made about the name Mike Enos? And have you ever thought about what it sounds like for two Irishmen to interpret a very chaotic company through its B show? The answers to all this and more are just a click away. Check out Days of Thunder every second Thursday on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network.
Hey everybody, my name is Jesse Collings, and I am the host of the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast, a show right here on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network. On the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast, we take a deep look at individual issues and stories that are going on in the wrestling world. Each episode is about a different topic, and we take a thorough and educated look at things ranging from current booking trends to breakdowns on individual performers and angles to investigations into different fan cultures across the industry. In addition, we keep a close eye on the wrestling media, and as a professional journalist, I bring a unique perspective to how current issues in wrestling are being covered and discussed through the wrestling media. We have a revolving series of guests from across wrestling punditry joining us on each episode, and we hope that you make the choice to give us a listen on wherever you get your podcast from.